Resident Evil Requiem got a lot of praise and obviously does a lot of things right. It is overall a very good game. Some call it even the best Resident Evil game in the series. But I would not go that far. While it has some aspects that are excellent, in some areas it struggles a bit. While you maybe have heard about its many very positive aspects, I would like to focus on those that hold the game back a bit. Don't get me wrong though, it is like an 8 out of 10 for me and I've already completed it 2 times. If I isolate some areas, I would even rate it a bit higher. Visually it's absolutely stunning. It runs mostly very well. With Grace they established a cool new character to the series. Angela Santalbano, the actress who played Grace, did a phenomenal job. The sound design and music is great, and the game has a great atmosphere and can be quite scary. Some action sequences are a lot of fun and it has some cool boss fights. The animation work is also again phenomenal, all embedded in Capcom's modern Resident Evil formula, which they refined over the years in the new titles and remakes. Despite so much praise, I found it interesting to explore what problems are holding the game back and why it is not the best game in the series for me. My name is Chris, aka The Philosopher's Games, or TPhGames as my little games channel here is called, and today we discuss Resident Evil Requiem, which I played on PC. I try to avoid spoilers as much as possible. One of its core strengths is also one of its weaknesses for me. Throughout the whole game it feels like a best of modern Resident Evil games, the game. This is of course great, but at the same time, if you know the last 5 modern Resident Evils, Requiem seems often too familiar and offers not enough new elements, and the new elements it has are mostly placed in the first half. While it's always nice to see some references, and a modern video game is also always built on past experiences, Requiem, in my opinion, consists too much of already known pieces. Like I said, it feels mostly like a best of. You might ask, why is that a problem? I think for a game to be good or even very good, that is not a problem at all. But for a game to be exceptional, that is a problem. For it to be exceptional, it would need to bring a new twist to these best of elements, and here, in my opinion, Requiem does not fully deliver. Yes, they add a new crafting mechanic, which I call blood magic, and yes, establishing a completely new character like Grace is definitely a big new element, considering that she is very different compared to classic Resident Evil main characters. But beyond that, and especially in sections after the mansion part of the game nosedives when it comes to new elements or bringing a new twist to the established ones. Without spoiling, the last sections are often too similar to what we already played in the past games, and in my opinion, you find the weakest parts of the game there, though there are still cool moments as well. It of course also plays with nostalgia for long-time Resident Evil fans. This was now quite abstract, so let us get a bit more specific. Resident Evil 9 lacks enemy variety and new enemies. There are far too few different enemy types for the amount of fighting, and the biggest variety we find, as said, is in the first half of the game. Of course, it sounds strange to criticize this in a zombie game, but they definitely showed in the first half that they can absolutely present us new interesting enemies or new variants of existing ones. The zombies that still repeat what they often did in life, like the zombie at the light switch, are a cool idea, and also the special enemies in the mansion are quite nice, with some interactions that you can use to your advantage. The last half is quite lacking in that regard. If you for example look at Resident Evil 4 Remake, it brought a new zombie setting with the Las Plagas that, though in core, was very similar to the classic Resident Evil zombie scenario, it still felt very different just due to that and the setting in Spain alone. You were used to Raccoon City zombies from Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 Remake, and then the Resident Evil 4 Remake felt like something new. Resident Evil 2 and 4 also play quite different. Survival horror versus survival terror. I would also say that Resident Evil Village and Biohazard often felt quite unique in their settings too. Of course, you can argue enemy variety was not that big in some acclaimed Resident Evil games in the past as well. For example, in Resident Evil 7, the enemy variety is very low as well, but that game is far less about fighting zombies, and it was the successful reinvention of the Resident Evil series. Of course, they developed further from that point on. In contrast, Resident Evil Requiem has a lot of fighting in it and far fewer puzzles and exploration sections. Resident Evil 7 is also a bit shorter in comparison, I think. Another aspect is that in video games I like exploring locations I have not seen before. Returning to a classic location can be a nice addition, especially for that little nostalgia kick, but I think Requiem offers too little when it comes to new locations. Even the praised care center section seems in parts and structure quite familiar already, and the sections after that even more so. If we look at the care center, we are again in a mansion and have to find 3 pieces to open a door. Yes, seen that a million times already in Resident Evil. Capcom played it a bit too safe in that regard. And guess what? Having to find like 3 quest items to open the next door repeats in the game quite a few times as well. Classic Resident Evil in all those points, you could say, but it's all about how often you can repeat the same design and also balance, which I felt was a bit off in Requiem at times, and after so many games you notice the formula they use quite strongly. So for it to be exceptional, it needs a better balance, more variety and more elements that are new or have at least a new interesting twist. The potential though was definitely there, but you can't play it safe and stick out in a franchise that had recently quite a few very good titles. Though I praised the mansion, the care center part a lot, a small point of criticism for me is that it is a bit too linear. The whole game is quite linear to be fair, but at least in one of the later sections where you have to yet again find 3 parts to open a door, you can choose the order to some degree. In the mansion that is not possible. There is a clear order in which you have to get the items. Besides these elements, I also found the story quite weak. It has its moments for sure, but how everything is connected and why characters do certain things in the game you should not think too much about. Some plot elements made little sense to me, and I know Resident Evil stories are wild and sometimes even quite goofy in parts, but Requiem's story often felt quite off. I know Resident Evil usually has these cheesy B-movie stories, but from my perspective, Requiem struggles to connect story parts together and explain motivations of characters, even to the absolute minimum, especially the antagonists. In the first minutes of the game, we learn that the bad guy wants to kidnap Grace and that she is special. Why would he then present a danger to her that could have gotten her killed? And then continues to do so. This is just a small example, without spoiling too much, but there are many more glaring examples. It's also a strong contrast to the high production value of the game. It is so strong in many aspects. The awesome acting and voice acting, the high visual fidelity, the great cutscene direction and camera work, the sound and music, etc. Everything is at a very high quality, but the plot is that of a B-movie that has been in production hell for 10 years. Sure, you can come up with some explanations, but that is not on us, to be honest. The game needs to explain to us how plot points are connected. I also think the environmental storytelling and other means of telling the background story, like notes you find, in the second half is quite lacking as well. In the care center, you find a total of 41 files, which is more than in the next sections to the end combined. The next big section has only around 18 files, which one could say is fitting to that setting, but we also learn almost nothing about what was going on in that area through environmental storytelling, though there would have been a lot of potential for this. Then in the final section of the game, where the player still has many questions, we only find around 10 files and many questions remain unanswered. But here the location would allow to find tons of files. A detail I personally liked was the switching between Grace and Leon. In my opinion, it was very good for the pacing of the game. On your first playthrough, when you carefully explore the scary mansion with Grace, it's a nice change to have a short action sequence with Leon and then switch back to sneaking with Grace again. Worked really well for my taste. Unfortunately, in the later sections, these character switches become more rare. Why not a deal breaker, it maybe would have elevated the game even further if they would have managed to keep it up throughout the game. I think the times where we get 2 campaigns, so one with each character, like in the Resident Evil 2 remake, are sadly over though. Another very small point which I criticized in a lot of other games in the past is also slightly present in Resident Evil Requiem, but also other Resident Evil games. If the game does not want you to go, for example, back or forth, it sometimes finds no good explanations why that is not possible. Doors are magically closed and locked to block the way, and characters teleport around too. Right at the start of the game, we get this blue tarp, probably made of duranium from Star Trek, at least it's absolutely immovable. Not a good excuse why I'm not able to leave the area again. Many doors are locked and opened conveniently throughout the game, but at least the devs do not rely too much on invisible walls. Only in the more open areas we find them at times, and then the character at least comments that it is the wrong way. I have seen far worse offenders here, but still found it here and there noticeable. However, it's just me nitpicking here. Speaking of nitpicking, how saving works is inconsistent between Leon and Grace. Leon gets autosaves all the time, Grace almost none. So if you have not saved for 40 minutes, die with Grace on standard modern and think, oh well, the game will have given me an autosave for sure somewhere in between, you are in for a devastating surprise. That is completely different for Leon though. In my opinion, that makes sense on standard classic difficulty and higher, but I think there is no need for that on the lower difficulties. Speaking of difficulty, standard modern has weaker enemies than standard classic. So there are different difficulty settings beyond just making you use ink ribbons to save, which only Grace has to use by the way. Very misleading naming here in my opinion. I thought on my first playthrough that enemy strength is the same, just the ink ribbon mechanic is different. Also, the last difficulty is interesting and really hard if you don't play with absurd unlocks, which is what I'm currently trying. As said earlier, the animation work also seems fantastic. For example, sometimes Grace, in third person, moves her left arm and shoulder away from the wall or a colliding object when you walk past it, or she is touching a wall or a door when it's closed in first person and you walk against it. If you look closely, you notice a ton of animation detail and really smooth animation transitions. Really impressive. Further, it's a cool feature to switch between first and third person perspective as well, and animations in both perspectives look great. Must have been a ton of work to make the animations compatible and playtest everything. Interestingly, in some edge cases with Leon's finisher animations, the game suddenly moves the enemy and Leon to a better position to avoid clipping, I assume, which is one of the few not smooth transitions I've found. That is impressive, to be honest. Very few games reach this animation quality, especially with 2 different camera perspectives. But we are used to this kind of quality from the other modern Resident Evil games already, so Requiem can't stick out much here compared to the other games. This now all sounds very negative, and as said at the start, I wanted to focus on Resident Evil Requiem's problems here. It still is a really good game, and I had a lot of fun with it. It has very strong moments, cool boss fights, and some really good ideas. Blood Mage Grace as a character is a strong addition to the series. It looks, sounds and plays very well, and there would have been the potential for it to be an exceptional new entry in the franchise, setting the bar even higher, or at least reaching recent highs like the Resident Evil 4 remake. But here Capcom maybe plays it a bit too safe. and they further can't overcome the habit to start strong and fall off after the first half. Of course, the second half also has some great sections like the Willis Tower, but it is a mixed bag here and there, with also some annoying sections and simply not enough new stuff. I also think that Capcom wants to use Requiem as some kind of reset point for all those messy stories they put out in the past and build the franchise further from this point. The implications in the story of Requiem at least give some space for that, and they might retcon some past stuff as well. I also could imagine that there will be a DLC for Requiem. Curious if that will address some of the criticisms. Overall, a great game with some flaws that hold it back to become one of the best games in the franchise, at least for me personally. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, press the like button, subscribe, maybe check out my other content and leave a comment. Links are in the description. How did you like Requiem? Can you agree with some of my points? Would you have liked to see one campaign for each character that connects at certain points, like in Resident Evil 2? Also, huge shoutouts to all my supporters on Patreon, YouTube, Twitch, Ko-fi and so on. Thank you, much appreciated. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.